Hello? Good afternoon, and welcome to the 27 Holberg Laureate lecture. I will introduce the laureate and ask her to come to the podium when I am done. She needs to get her material sorted, and we'll have time. We have had a strict time schedule today, so it's no joke getting a prize. Onora O'Neill is one of the most distinguished and influential philosophers of her generation. Her work on moral and political philosophy, above all her research on Immanuel Kant, has contributed to a resurgence of interest in his work. In her early books, Acting on Principle from 1975 and Constructions of Reason from 1989, O'Neill challenges received wisdom, which argued that Kant saw reasoning as requiring that we make it possible for others to understand what we say and to grasp what we do. She has also demonstrated in works such as Faces of Hunger from 1986 and Bounds of Justice how philosophy may provide vital insights into some of the most pressing moral issues of our time. And she has changed the understanding of the nature of our obligations in an unequal world. To quote the committee's citation, quote, "While rigorously arguing for a world of porous boundaries and a more dispersed and even distribution of power, O'Neill showed how doctrines of rights and notions of obligation require us to pay attention not just to the needs of strangers, but to the structural conditions of oppression that mark the lives of so many people in the world," end quote. In an exemplary way, O'Neill has shown, through her academic work and her public service, how philosophy can become relevant to civic and political life. Onora O'Neill was born in Northern Ireland in 1941 and educated in Germany, Britain, and the United States. She studied philosophy at the University of Oxford under the tutorship of Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot, and she later pursued her doctoral degree in philosophy at Harvard University under the supervision of John Rawls. After teaching for a few years at Barnard College, Columbia University, New York, Onora O'Neill returned to the UK in 1978, when she took up a lectureship in philosophy at the University of Essex, where she also became professor in 1987. In 1992, she was appointed principal of Newnham College at the University of Cambridge, where she is today honorary professor of philosophy emeritus. O'Neill was made a life peer in the House of Lords in 1999, and she has served on countless policy committees and public advisory boards, including the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and the Human Advisory Commission, as well as the Human Genetics Advisory Commission, which she also chaired. In addition, she has served on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which she also chaired. She is now a member of the Banking Standards Board, tasked with improving banking culture and accountability in the UK. O'Neill has been president of the British Academy and has served as chairperson of the British Philosophical Association. She's currently a foreign member of the Royal Irish Academy, of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of the Norwegian Academy. She was made Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society in 2007. Professor O'Neill has been awarded over 20 honorary degrees from universities in the UK and in Europe. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to ask Professor O'Neill to come to the podium to deliver her Holberg Lecture 2017. Thank you.
Well, I have to give my warmest thanks to the Holberg Committee, not merely for this wonderful prize, but for making the occasion enjoyable, exciting, and beautifully organized, all of the above. Now, today I thought that partly as it were, the backdrop for the topics that were discussed this morning, I would try to say something about where I think we are in ethics. It's a big topic, and it's not an entirely happy picture, but I think it could perhaps help us also in thinking about communication, but some other things. So I'm doing something I don't often do, which is really to use some quite lightly sketched themes, which you may say a history of ideas, not philosophy, to try and give us a sense of where we may have got to. And you could perhaps guess that from the title, Justice Without Ethics, a 20th Century Innovation. Just to sketch the direction in which I'm going, as I see it, for many centuries, we discussed justice and ethics. We saw them as linked domains of duty in European thought and culture. That wasn't very controversial. But in the 20th century, they've been seen as diverging in quite marked, interesting, and I think rather unsettling ways. There's now pretty widespread acceptance that justice is a matter for respect for supposedly objectively justified human rights, but that other ethical standards lack wider justification and that they reflect, according to some, individual choice, according to others, shared standards. And I'm going to argue that this view promotes inadequate accounts both of justice and of ethical standards. So first I should say a little bit about domains of duty. For many centuries, discussions of justice and ethics were linked. Now they've diverged. European traditions saw these discussions as offering separate, yes, distinct, but deeply linked answers to the classical question, what ought we do? Duties of justice were seen as setting requirements on states and on other powerful institutions and individuals, and were intended to structure the public domain, typically by their incorporation, of course, into law and by use of legal sanctions. Ethical duties also set requirements, at least for some institutions and for individuals, but these were to be secured by cultural and individual efforts rather than by law. Yet, by the start of the 21st century, in our day, claims that justice and ethics were complementary and linked domains of duty, although, of course, it's still deeply embedded in European languages and culture, were often questioned. They were quite often ignored. They were even explicitly rejected by some. Today, I think it's much more widely assumed that although standards of justice have universal scope and are of high importance for all societies, other ethical standards do not have universal scope and are, on some accounts, a private or individual matter without wider normative importance. Principles of justice, in particular those now seen as setting human rights standards, are seen as establishing universal standards that should shape law and regulation, and thereby both institutional and individual action in all jurisdictions. Ethical principles are thought of as anchored in specific cultures or in individual choices and preferences, and as lacking wider scope or justification. Now, these are momentous changes, and I don't, of course, mean that everybody endorses them, but they are very widespread, and it's not immediately, I think, obvious how or why they've come about. So I'm going to begin with some very sketchy reminder of past views of duty, and some of the changes that have led many to see justice, so often now identified with meeting human rights standards, as fundamental and universal, to be embodied and enforced by law, but other ethical standards as the creature of cultures, individual choices, or preferences. And I shall suggest that some reasons for the divergence between the justifications, and in many cases the lack of justifications, proposed for duties of justice and ethical duties, and I shall ask how complete and convincing the separation is, and whether justice can indeed be realized if we don't take ethical duties and their justification seriously. So let me talk a little bit now about the decline of duty. Both philosophical and popular conceptions of justice and ethics had traditionally centered on duties, not on rights. In Europe, duties had been central to normative debate since antiquity and had shaped religious, philosophical, and popular discussions of how institutions should be constituted and how lives should be lived. Rights, if they were discussed, were seen either as so-called special rights created by particular transactions or of general rights. And the general rights were corollaries not of all duties, but of a specific set of so-called perfect, that means just in this context, complete duties, that also specified who had a right to and could claim performance of a certain duty. But it was widely noted, although this is an awkward topic, that some perfect duties lack counterpart rights. If you want examples, think of duties to self or indeed certain very fundamental political duties. But ethical duties, for example, of beneficence, loyalty, courage, honesty, were seen as imperfect, meaning just incomplete duties, and as lacking counterpart rights. Many thought of them as duties of virtue. The term isn't entirely apt, because respect for them often depended on character and culture rather than on compliance with enforceable requirements. Now, given that duties don't have to be matched by counterpart rights, normative reasoning that focuses on duties can, in principle, offer a wider perspective than can be reached by taking rights as fundamental. If you start with the duties, you'll get the rights where there are corollary rights, as it were, thrown in for free. But if you start with rights, you won't get certain duties at all. If rights are taken as fundamental, no account will be given of duties that lack counterpart rights. They're going to turn out to be invisible. And contemporary human rights discourse can therefore engage at most with a subset of possible claims about duties. It's not always obvious. Indeed, some contemporary advocates of human rights assume that their approach extends and strengthens rather than restricts older accounts of what ought to be done. However, while treating rights as foundational may support stronger claims about sanctions and about enforcement than reasoning that treats duties as basic and support, the scope of rights claims will usually be narrower than, and cannot be broader than that, of claims about duties. In the main, this momentous change in views about duty took place in the 20th century, but I think there were many earlier signs of at least unease. Duty was certainly still preeminent in discussions of what ought to be done at the start of the 19th century, where it remained center stage across the spectrum from Immanuel Kant's late practical philosophy to Wordsworth's 1805 Ode to Duty, with its very confident equation of duty with divine command. Here's Wordsworth. Stern daughter of the voice of God, O duty, if that name thou love, who art a light to guide, a rod to check the erring and reprove, thou who art victory and law, when empty terrors overawe, from vain temptations dost set free, and calmst the weary strife of frail humanity. I won't quote Kant to you at this point. But by the middle of the 19th century, claims about duty evoked patchy unease, sometimes even hostility. Some of those who showed unease feared the undermining of moral certainties and clarity. Others were, however, positively eager to see duty downgraded. I think fear is a predominant note in Matthew Arnold's wistful sadness about the waning of Christian faith and the ebbing of duty. This is from Dover Beach. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. And then he turns to what he thinks is left. He's speaking to his love. Our love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light nor certitude nor peace nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. But less than 30 years later, reading Friedrich Nietzsche, I think we find a much more robust thought. It's not fear, but the thought that there's nothing but gain in doing without any reference to duty. Here's something that Nietzsche wrote in The Antichrist. What destroys a man more quickly than to work, think, and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure as a mere automaton of duty? And although their attitudes to the decline of duty are really poles apart, both Matthew Arnold and Friedrich Nietzsche see the alternative as an increasing emphasis on personal and subjective standards and concerns. In this they were prophetic. Claims that personal and subjective choices are the successors to the claims of duty gained increasing prominence. At the very start of the 20th century, the philosopher G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica ends with a surprisingly influential chapter that endorses a privatized version of ethics centered on individual experiences of beauty, pleasure, friendship, and knowledge, but no longer on families, institutions, communities, or nations, or their action, and least of all on duty. But there was more and, if you like, worse to come. But this was not the end of duty, because there was a remarkable episode, I think very much centered around the years of the First World War, in which one duty above all, patriotic duty, rose up to the top of the scale. The slow retreat of support for duty among intellectuals or poets didn't undermine the ethics of duty in everyday life, and one appeal gained great prominence during the First World War. And it took the form of widespread, sometimes enthusiastic insistence that you ought to do your duty, which is above all to serve your country and even to kill or be killed for your country. Of course, most who took this view saw duty to king or Kaiser and country as the public face of duty, to be honored alongside duties to God, to family and friends, to neighbors and to the poor. Yet a belief that patriotic duty had this distinctive, possibly overriding importance became very briefly and wildly popular. It's very sobering, I find, to remember the fervor with which the outbreak of war in 1914 was greeted, and how widely a patriotic cause was seen as a matter of duty, indeed of noble duty. Some even represented, or perhaps misrepresented, patriotic duty as an ethic of sacrifice. Those killed in conflict were seen as making the ultimate sacrifice, even if they were conscripts who hardly had a choice of their fate. The idea that being killed for a cause and killing for a cause were forms of noble blood sacrifice, that was the phrase, was quite widely discussed. Some supporters of the Easter 1916 rising against British rule in Ireland described those who lost their lives in attacks that they had initiated as martyrs. And this terminology This misleading terminology is still popular in some quarters, particularly, of course, at present in the rhetoric of so-called Islamic State. Classically, martyrs defend a noble or principled cause and then are killed by others for doing so. That is what a martyr is. Something very surprising is going on when those who kill themselves for a cause, like hunger strikers, or who kill others who are no threat to them for a cause, for example, suicide bombers, are being described as martyrs. This, it seems to me, is quite vivid evidence of an ethical tradition falling into decay or confusion. It's not that this exaggerated emphasis on patriotic duty in the early years of the First War was universally shared. Even among those who were close to and sympathetic to the cause of Irish independence, you can, of course, find quite different voices. For example, the poet W.B. Yeats explicitly rejects it in his wartime poem, which, by the way, he deliberately did not publish until after the war, called An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, in which he contrasts patriotic duty with personal choice, but drawing a rather different view. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seem wasted breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. But, of course, the crowds who cheered in 1914 thought otherwise. Nevertheless, and unsurprisingly, enthusiasm for patriotic duty waned as the war proved more catastrophically brutal and destructive than expected, or even imagined. Hostility to that narrow conception of public duty as patriotism in wartime mounted. It became, as we all know, a leading theme of the poetry of the First War, and it animates E.M. Foster, the novelist's much-quoted aphorism, if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. The thought that personal loyalties are more important than patriotic duty now resonated and spread, and criticism of patriotic duty expanded into far wider questioning and criticism of all duties. I now want to give you a little sketch of some much narrower intellectual currents between the wars, forms of positivism. Between the two wars, but initially, of course, only in quite limited academic circles, a much more systematic retreat from duty gained ground. The startling success of logical positivism, with its uncompromising insistence that only empirically verifiable and analytical claims were meaningful, and consequently that ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, and theology could all be jettisoned as literally meaningless, rejected both duties of justice and ethical duties. Now, logical positivism didn't offer convincing arguments for these claims, and those it offered were very soon questioned, rejected, or dismissed. Nevertheless, its influence spread from narrow philosophical circles in Berlin and Vienna, partly because so many of its early exponents were driven into exile across the world at the end of the 1930s. So, while logical positivism failed to show that claims about justice and ethics were literally meaningless, its success was to spread skepticism about their justification. Doing without an account of duty has high costs. In the face of the further catastrophes of the Second World War, it was very widely agreed that standards mattered, especially for the public domain. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by member states of the United Nations in the late 40s and signaled a wide commitment to a range of universal standards of justice. However, the Universal Declaration differed from older approaches to justice in three ways, at least three ways, there may be more. It addressed justice from the recipient's rather than agent's perspective by setting out a list of human rights whose realization would require others to carry the counterpart duties. It was silent about ethical duties, and it was often justified by an appeal to authority. The last of these difficulties is perhaps fundamental. Appeals to declarations and conventions or to other legal instruments, such as constitutions, treaties, or statute, are appeals to authority. They can offer convincing justifications only to those who accept the authority to which appeal is made. So while the post-World War II affirmation of human rights does not endorse logical positivism, it frequently relies on arguments from authority and thereby draws on various forms of legal positivism. Those who hope to justify human rights by appealing to authority, it is true, ignored the flamboyant methodological claims of the logical positivists, but they too marginalize or reject demands for deeper justification. Both the Universal Declaration and the very slightly later European Convention on Human Rights, adopted by the Council of Europe in 1950, assumed that if the relevant instruments are endorsed by state agreement and ratification, that will secure their authority. While many who stress the authoritative backings of human rights think that appeals to authority are not enough, and that human rights also require deeper, perhaps moral justification, the justifications that have been offered have typically been, let's say it kindly, skimpy. They seem to take it for granted that the rights set out in the canonical declarations and charters will be the rights that can be justified. And contemporary life, as you all know, remains deeply influenced by these versions of legal positivism, and it frequently avoids or evades questions about deeper justifications of the standards it proclaims. However, I suspect that this is actually not a very popular view. I suspect that acceptance of versions of legal positivism is just not as widely accepted as appeals to argument from authority in support of those claims about human rights may suggest. Despite uncertainties about deeper justifications and about questions of justification, many people who set store by human rights and international law, and more broadly by the rule of law, by detailed regulation and by demanding standards of accountability, probably think that deeper justifications can be provided and wider ethical backing for human rights standards is somehow available. However, for everyday purposes, they seemingly find it variously necessary or adequate, or perhaps just advantageous to appeal to authority, whether the Universal Declaration, the European Convention, or other particular treaties laws, and they ignore demands for deeper justification. Now, this is not a happy situation to land in, the question is, what happened to duty as this change took place? In the end, in my view, the ancient alliance between ethics and political philosophy was not undermined by the inadequacy of justificatory arguments, but by the emergence of totalitarian regimes and the huge human and moral costs of their policies. These same realities, however, at least, made it all too obvious that consigning at least justice to the dustbin of history had been a pretty bad plan. Yet what emerged after World War II was not, of course, a revised or improved version of the ethics of duty. If anything, appeals to duty became yet more suspect because they were repeatedly misappropriated to cloak official misdeeds under totalitarian regimes, from Eichmann to the Stasi. Morally rebarbative action by state officials was all too often mischaracterized and falsely dignified as a matter of duty. So while both the Universal Declaration and the European Convention look superficially as if they might reinstate an account of duties of justice that is nicely shorn of metaphysical and theological underpinnings and can rise above official misappropriation, the reality is probably less clear and more troubling. I list some obvious difficulties that arise when an account of justice is detached from deeper justification and from any wider account of ethical duties. First, because declarations and conventions aren't in the business of deeper justification, it is obviously unclear what normative weight should attach to the standards they proclaim. To be sure, treating the Universal Declaration and the European Convention as fundamental authorities means that human rights can be supported in many, but not all contexts, by pointing to these instruments and to the fact that some, but not all, states have ratified them. The downside, of course, is that these positive justifications provide no reasons for states that have not signed up to do so, and, an all too common problem, for states that have signed up but then ignore or flout human rights standards, probably an even more common problem, to change their ways. Secondly, the rights proclaimed in 1948 were not linked to any account of the allocation of the necessary counterpart duties to competent agents. That may be unproblematic for the case of where duties must be held by all. For example, the duties that correspond to certain liberty rights, duties not to coerce or injure others, other negative duties, must be held by all if others are to enjoy secure liberty rights. However, other duties that support liberty rights, such as duties to enforce and protect those rights, must be held by specific agents and agencies rather than by all. And duties to realize social and economic rights must be allocated to identifiable, competent agents in order to determine who ought to do what for whom. Proclaiming rights without specifying the necessary counterpart duties and duty bearers simply leaves it unclear what action is required of whom. The drafting of the Universal Declaration had gestured to the thought that the counterpart duties lie with states, or specifically with the states party, the states that sign up. But it then had confusingly also referred variously to nations, countries, and peoples, entities that lack the integrated capacities for action and decision-making required for agencies, let alone for carrying complex duties to respect and realize the proclaimed rights. So I think it's no wonder that some initially complained that the rights that had been declared in the Universal Declaration were no more than manifesto rights, nice gestures but without counterpart duties and without clear practical import. These lacunae were addressed up to a point by two United Nations covenants of 1966, implemented about a decade afterwards, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These explicitly and specifically assign certain relevant duties to states that ratify these instruments. But despite the claimed universality of human rights, this approach left the inhabitants of states that didn't sign up or didn't ratify in limbo. Moreover, a careful look at the covenants suggests that they don't, in fact, assign the duties that have to be met to secure the Universal Declaration rights to the signatory states. Rather, they assign those states certain second-order duties to allocate and enforce some configuration of duties that will ensure respect for the rights or support the realization of the rights, and that is much less than assigning the duties. Here is Article 2 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It says this: each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources with a view to achieve progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including particularly the adoption of legislative measures. Nice, but limited. Because achieving progressively the full realization of rights by all appropriate means is simply a matter of ensuring that unspecified others, individuals and institutions that are not identified and that may not or not yet exist discharge the complex range of duties needed to secure these rights. So it was a gesture towards having someone or other carry the duties, but it wasn't clear quite how. It requires states to construct institutions and to delegate tasks in order to secure some effective allocation of the counterpart duties. So whereas traditional discussions of duties of justice had focused on human duties to others, the discourse of human rights was always more indirect. It focused on second-order duties to bring about some allocation of first-order duties that could, if observed, secure the human rights that had been declared. Despite this limitation, I think that the covenants of 1966, now of course past their 60th year, were clearly in advance on the more indeterminate claims of the Universal Declaration, and they went some way to address the accusation that human rights were no more than manifesto rights. Human rights were now to be seen as rights with counterpart duties that the signatory states, but not other states, had second-order duties to assign and to ensure were respected or realized by those to whom they were assigned. Was it a good idea? It's a very powerful idea, but is it a good idea to assign these complex second-order duties entirely to the state's party? One answer might be it was a good idea, at least at the time, because only states had powers sufficient to secure respect for and realization of rights by others. A second, but rather more pessimistic answer might be that assigning the task of ensuring that everyone and all institutions respect and realize rights to the most powerful institutions, namely states, is very problematic. It's rather like assigning the supervision of hen houses to foxes. And that parallel, I'm afraid, is often illustrated by the reality that certain states have indeed been major and persistent violators of human rights. That is to say, the standard setters don't really look well equipped for the task. A third answer, which interests me, is that the allocation of duties at which the covenants aimed is now obsolescent. The year 1966 could be seen as a high water mark of state power. The Western colonial empires were being dismantled. A Westphalian world of independent states seemed to be emerging. Both old and new states were taken to have, and sometimes did have, effective boundaries, and some of them could exercise power effectively within those boundaries. Since then, however, globalization has, of course, been transforming and reconfiguring power in ways that often make securing respect for and realization of human rights a good bit harder for states. Our world not merely includes a range of rogue states and failed states that will not or cannot secure or respect rights for their inhabitants, but it is a world of porous borders in which many states find their power to secure and respect an adequate realization of rights is constrained by a variety of powerful non-state and sometimes super-state actors. These fundamental changes suggest that it may now be less feasible for states that are party to international instruments to be the sole and pivotal bearers and guarantors of second-order duties to ensure that others respect and realize rights. Moreover, even where first-order duties to respect and realize human rights can be effectively allocated to competent agents, ethical duties might also be needed for these rights to be secured. Declarations of rights are unavoidably silent about those duties that lack counterpart rights, so they're silent about ethical duties. But it's far from clear that duties of justice, including those that are the counterparts to human rights standards, can be implemented without cultivating certain ethical duties. Moreover, it's far from clear that treating rights rather than duties as fundamental leaves either justice or the rest of ethics unchanged. The cultural costs of prioritizing recipients over action and rights over duties is high because it prioritizes a view of human beings as claimants or victims and may give undue prominence to passive and reactive responses, including resentment, rancor, and blame. I'll return to consider whether justice can do without ethics at the end of this lecture, but I want to say first a little bit about justification. I think the contemporary landscape has also some encouraging feature. Most evidently, deeper justification, at least of principles of justice, is once again taken to be important, and arguments from authority are not endorsed or assumed in all discussions of justice. In the early post-war period, many still assumed that logical positivism, or something or other, had undermined duties of justice as well as ethical duties, and claims that, I quote, political philosophy is dead, were widely asserted and discussed in the 50s and a little beyond. The phrase, I think, is originally due to Peter Laslett. But this is no longer the case. Since the 1970s, political philosophy has flourished again. Accounts of justice, we think in the main of notable writers like John Rawls, Robert Nozick, Jürgen Habermas, but many, many others, have since extended and elaborated accounts of justice and have aimed to offer deeper justifications of those standards of justice, and they don't view arguments from authority as the sole or adequate backing for standards of justice. So that, I think, is useful, in fact important. But while the vast body of contemporary writing in political philosophy seeks deeper justifications of duties of justice than one can squeeze out of the authority of declarations and conventions, it too, for the most part, ignores wider ethical questions. Like advocates of human rights, many contemporary political philosophers take it that deeper justification of other ethical standards or principles is just not feasible. The thought that we can provide deep, or at least deeper reasons for principles of justice, but not for other ethical principles, is central to John Rawls's late work. It hadn't been central to his early work. His 1985 article, Justice as Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical, led the way, and his 1993 book, Political Liberalism, and many of his later essays argue explicitly that deeper justification can support only principles of justice and cannot be extended to other ethical principles, and that was contrary to the position he'd taken in A Theory of Justice. Rawls's late work aims to justify principles of justice, but no more, and he rejects all forms of what has come to be called comprehensive liberalism that argues for ethical as well as political duties, or at least some ethical duties, in favor of the position he calls political liberalism. That is a term of art, because we may all have thought liberalism is a political position, but political liberalism meant specifically and narrowly liberalism that is silent about ethical duties. A similar focus on justice without close link to ethics can be found in the work of other leading contributors to the revival of political philosophy. Jürgen Habermas explicitly anchored justificatory arguments in the possibility of agreement reached via inclusive political discourse, and Nozick's libertarian arguments support a maximal private sphere in which individuals' choices and preferences are seen as decisive, and of course, over in the next department, neoclassical economists have argued for similar positions and from similar premises. That is to say that the revived political philosophy of the last half-century has, for the most part, left ethical duties and their justification out of scope. What can we then say about ethical principles beyond the domain of justice? The thought that justifications can support political but not ethical standards fits pretty well with some aspects of traditional liberal ideals. It can, after all, support the thought that liberal conceptions of justice can and should protect individual choice and preference. But much as this matters, it can hardly be the whole story. Nobody thinks that it does not matter what individuals choose, or that all choices should be protected. Yet if deeper justifications support only an account of justice, the only choices their proponents can find reason to criticize, sanction, or forbid will seemingly be those that breach a requirement of justice, for example, by violating others' rights, a conclusion that is, of course, much stressed and treasured by various liberals and close to the heart of libertarian liberals. It seems to me implausible to think that a convincing account of justice can be indifferent to everything that is not unjust. More is surely at stake, and some choices are more valuable than others. Now, these issues are, I think, often obscured by a promiscuous use of the term value to refer to what individuals happen to choose or to prefer. This leaves it fatally obscure whether empirical or normative claims are at stake. Where empirical claims are made about individuals' choices or preferences, there won't be any general reason to see anything, let alone everything, that is chosen or preferred by some agents as valuable. Much that is chosen or preferred by some people at some times may be valuable, but much is also worthless or bad. Some individuals may choose self-enrichment or sadistic treatment of others. This doesn't show that self-enrichment and sadism are values, and the fact that some people choose or pursue them does not make them into values. Referring to whatever individuals happen to choose as values, which has become absolutely commonplace, I think confuses empirical claims about individuals' preferences with normative claims about what is valuable. There we see again, I suspect, the legacy of logical positivism, despite its brief flourishing and bad arguments. It's just led us into a situation where there's widespread conflation of empirical with normative claims. 3 snapshot illustrations of such confusion was all I can give you here. First, discussions of individual autonomy. There are very many different conceptions of individual autonomy, and they are all extremely different from Kant's conception of autonomy, although they often claim his authority for various positions. Individual autonomy is now widely spoken of in reverential tones as a highly important value. But individual autonomy can be used to adopt odious as well as admirable principles and decisions, and it's less than clear why it is to be valued unless we can offer an account of differences between ethically valuable and ethically unacceptable uses of individual autonomy. If you don't have an account of ethics, why would you be sold on individual autonomy? Second, appeals to individuals' choices and preferences are, of course, central to much economic theory and to consumerist ideologies. But if individuals' actual preferences are automatically reclassified as values, then a covert and unsupported normative claim has been advanced. Promoting preferences by referring to them as values, I think, simply misleads. Thirdly, appeals to what is now often called individual identity discard the older and more precise idiom that was careful to distinguish between a person's sense of identity, a subjective matter, and her identity, not a subjective matter. This move is often then used to suggest that whatever I happen to choose defines, quotes, who I am, so must be of great importance and of value and deserves protection. This seems to me quite misleading. Identity in the older sense of the term may indeed be weighty and may define who I am, but it's not a matter of choice. Indeed, that it is not a matter of choice is the standard reason that was given for thinking that identity in that older sense of the term matters and deserves protection. However, if senses of identity are chosen by individuals, so are alterable, they will not define who I am, and it is less than clear why they are to be accorded distinctive weight over and above other choices. Where individuals are taken to choose, define, and redefine either values or identities, ethical claims are being replaced with subjective claims. What is then on offer is not a justification, but a devaluation of values. Let me now turn to what is probably the area that we were touching on this morning that is very difficult to think about. Can we indeed have justice without ethics? It's not unreasonable for those who think that ethical standards are a matter of individual choice to conclude that aiming for justice is enough, and the public domain need not take account of other ethical standards or their justification. It need just to leave room for it. Yet this view is not, I believe, consistent with taking justice seriously. Working out how to realize justice, and we touched on this morning, requires us to take a view not only of standards of justice, but of certain ethical standards that are needed for realizing justice and also of their justification. It's widely assumed that duties of justice and their counterpart rights can be secured and realized by instituting just constitutions and laws and then complying with and enforcing their requirements. But while requirements of justice limit and constrain just action, they offer, I think, only indeterminate guidance rather than complete instructions for action. Even when legal instruments have been reinforced with more specific regulations, and they've been supplemented with copious discursive guidance and backed by specific and demanding forms of accountability, even then, proliferating rules can never fully specify exactly what must be done or not done if justice is to be respected or realized. Providing more and more explicit procedures for deploying and applying rules has, of course, a place, particularly in the procedures of courts and tribunals, arbitration and administration. Doing so can help to ensure that established authorities decide how to proceed appropriately and can show whether their decision was reached by a duly constituted authority using an appropriate procedure. But these justifications are limited. They can show that the procedure was followed, but not that the decisions made or actions undertaken were acceptable, let alone optimal, for actual cases. Principles of justice, in short, like all principles of action, are indeterminate, and indeterminacy goes all the way down. This point of view is not new, and I don't think it's trivial either. Aristotle, Kant, and Wittgenstein all pointed out that rules of all sorts, principles, standards, guidelines, regulations, certain concepts indeed, are intrinsically incomplete, and also that indeterminacy cannot be eliminated by adding more rules, more requirements, more regulations, or more guidance. There's no way to extend the paraphernalia of institutional life that can set sharp boundaries between compliance and infraction for every situation. Trying to offer complete rules, instructions, or guidance is in principle impossible, not to mention daunting or depressing for those who are meant to live up to them, who may conclude that even compliance is just too exhausting and complicated and end up ignoring or flouting requirements or indeed gaming the rules that they encounter. Practical judgment is, I think, needed to shape action to fit standards of justice in particular contexts, and there can be no complete rules, no algorithms for practical judgment. Practical judgment, I think, is a matter of combining a clear sense of what may and what ought to be done, the various rules and standards that must be respected, with a grasp of further considerations that bear on action in actual cases. For example, in living up to standards of justice, agents may need to take into account not only those demands, but the feasibility, the consequences, the affordability, and the ethical acceptability of specific ways of implementing or living up to these standards in actual situations. Taking account of these considerations in particular contexts cannot be done well by relying on hunch or individual preference or subjective choice. Practical judgment is more likely to go well when it is informed and formed by interaction and communication with others who are sensitive to the multiplicity of practical and indeed cultural factors that bear on an actual situation and action in that situation. practical and cultural constraints can shape action in ways that respect not only the requirements of justice and the various laws, regulations, and other requirements that augment these requirements, but a much wider range of ethical and practical demands. Of course, I accept cultures too do not provide algorithms for action. We do not expect to have algorithms, but they do provide a formative discipline for individuals and institutions by enabling and indeed encouraging and shaping consideration and interrogation of ways of construing situations and proposals for action. Since cultural processes are interactive, they open practical, including ethical judgment, to check and challenge, to adjustment and moderation, and thereby, I think, also to realistic consideration of the way in which a plurality of ethical and other standards might be respected in actual situations. They can allow for and foster ways of respecting the requirements not only of justice, but also those of ethical duties and other practical requirements. Cultural processes provide a space for convergence of judgment, not forced, which respects a plurality of requirements, including both standards of justice and ethical standards. But there's a big caveat here. If cultures are needed for enacting justice, the ethical standards embedded in them and the justification of those standards will also matter for justice. As many proponents of justice point out, correctly, some cultures and many subcultures are ethically unacceptable. They may be corrupt or destructive, divisive or dishonest. They may ride roughshod over standards of justice. They may damage the capacity of those who live or work within them to engage or even to communicate with one another. But other cultures do not fail in this way. The insouciant marginalization of ethical justification that both positivist and subjectivist views of ethics have endorsed, even celebrated, overlooks the real need for ways by which the indeterminacy of standards of justice can be resolved and secured. Attempts to divide normative claims exhaustively to those that may or must be imposed by authority and those that are simply matters of individual choice or preference, therefore, I conclude, needs reconsideration, challenge, and as I see it, revision. Many versions of modern liberalism, including those popular among some supporters of human rights, those that follow the later writings of John Rawls and espouse forms of merely political liberalism, those that advocate varieties of libertarianism, or that rely on models of rational choice, all of these and many other positions have, in effect, bracketed or ignored wider questions of ethical justification and have treated ethical standards as subjective or private opinions that, in the end, simply lack deeper justification. In doing so, they've overlooked the ways in which the implementation of standards of justice needs to draw on and be shaped by a wider range of normative considerations. Implementing and enforcing just laws, regulation, and systems of accountability is not by itself enough, and specifically not enough for justice. Justice will also need the support of trustworthy and effective cultures and subcultures that enable those who inhabit them to bring not only practical but also ethical standards to the task of understanding what is at stake and working out what to do. So, for example, standards of honesty and reliability, standards of confidentiality and fairness, standards of trustworthiness and discretion, and many other ethical standards are not irrelevant to justice and cannot be supplanted by ever more detailed elaboration of law, regulation, and guidance. For a century past, our public discourse, the public discourse of liberal societies, has often turned away from ethical questions and from ethical justification and has assumed that standards of justice, as embodied in law, regulation, and accountability, are going to be enough for the public domain. while everything else is a matter of subjective preference and choice. They've ignored the extent to which effectively functioning institutions depend on the maintenance of ethical standards, most evidently perhaps of honesty and civility, confidentiality and fairness, trustworthiness and discretion, but also wider standards such as a degree of charity in construing what others say or do and solidarity in supporting their action. So I conclude that if we think justice matters, we cannot be indifferent to wider ethical standards or to their justification. Thank you. We apparently have a bit of time still.
Onora O'Neill has been generous enough to open up the floor for discussion, and she would be happy to take some questions or comments from you.
But you may need to spot hands in the far distance.
I will. Anybody? Rowan first, and then.
Okay. Thank you, Honora.
You wait for the mic.
Sorry, yes, I forgot. Hello. Thank you. No, that's great. I've actually got lots of questions. I can't ask lots of questions, I know. No. Thank you. So maybe just 2 points. One was a really small point, but one I'd like to know what you think about, which is was about how we understand justice. Because for you, the following three concepts go together: justice, rights, and something like law or coercion. And it wasn't clear to me they had to go together. We might be able to make sense of rights that aren't a matter of coercion, and I think you were yourself talking about duties duties that don't have rights on the other side, but are nonetheless a matter of justice. So I really just wanted to ask you about that bringing together of rights, justice, and law. And then I've got another question which I might ask if there's time.
I really dealt with two contemporary approaches to justice, one being very much centered in the human rights movement, in which I suppose justice is coextensive with the question of does the other person have a right to it? The other being centered on the contemporary developments of political philosophy, Rawls, Habermas, Sen, whomever, which is not very often not specifically centered on rights. And my criticism of those positions, and the reason why I think they are confined to justice, has to do with very specific assumptions they make. So when Rawls, for example, says he is looking at the things that would be agreed in a bounded liberal democratic society, you can just hear the confining of the questions to the political domain. And one could say similar things, I think, a bit different in detail, but similar things about Habermas or Sen or Nozick. So I don't think human rights is the only contemporary idiom, but it is much the most powerful idiom internationally.
Can I do one more or no? We've got.
We have two more back there, and then could you the young man there? Yes, the white.
Hi. It might be impossible to discuss ethics, justice, and human rights in the 21st century without mentioning Donald Trump. which I'm going to do.
I managed this afternoon.
Because what you discussed nearing the end of your lecture kind of got me thinking about the current political scene, and especially that when you talked about whether or not it's sufficient to only argue and justify laws and regulations and rights for if that is sufficient. Because that is, of course, a lot of the critique which has come against Donald Trump has been for that. He's breaking laws, he's breaking regulations, he's not doing things by the books. But people have critiqued those who have critiqued him that way, of saying that, that's what his followers like, because he's breaking rules, he's not following regulations, he's not following laws. And perhaps that might be due to there being a lack of discourse around ethical standards, as you suggest, if I understood you correctly. So that's my question. What do you think about what is happening in the United States right now, in accordance with I'm sorry if this is a very broad and poorly formulated question, but
well, you certainly broaden the field a lot there. Let me say, without saying too much, that I think that if you look at Mr. Trump's discourse, he certainly is not reluctant to use ethical terminology of all sorts. He will say that the way he is treated is unfair, and he will say that people are bad guys or good guys. He's full of ethical vocabulary. It's a separate question whether we can discern as it were, the standards, or indeed the consistency, or indeed the arguments that lie behind it. But I would not think that one of the criticisms of Trump is that he ignores all but standards of justice. A criticism a bit more frequently made is that he's a bit hazy even about those standards of justice that may be quite close to the Constitution of the United States. So I don't think but for that matter, I don't think most of us actually ignore those standards. Take honesty, because I think it's the most obvious case, and we were discussing it a good bit this morning. Honesty is one of those standards which is indispensable if the institutions are to work, and yet it takes us beyond the conceptions of duties of justice into a wider conception of duties. That's very sketchy, but I don't think I can do more now.
There was another person in the back there, somewhere there, to the left. Could you introduce yourself before you ask your question, please?
Yeah, my name is Tormod. Just really have a very broad and quick question. If we consider rights and you extend them, would you not have to say that universal rights would have to imply some universal duty, basically meaning that the less we all share the burden, the more difficult it will be to basically have any kind of right by default? Saying that human rights applies to everyone and then saying, but these people should carry it out. Does that not defeat the purpose of human rights?
It's conventional to say that there are certain human rights, particularly those that correspond to duties of justice, traditionally conceived, that those human rights do require universal support. For example, that everybody will have to refrain from murder and injury if a right not to be injured or not to be murdered is to be respected. It's conventional to think a bit differently about, for example, what are sometimes called, I think it's an odd terminology, rights, welfare rights. I prefer to call them rights to goods and services. But those probably have to be delivered by particular competent agents. As I remember, I think it was Jonathan Glover years ago saying, we can hardly say the right to food has a corresponding duty that each of us contribute a tiny fraction of a baked bean to each other person. That's not the way we organize things like a right to food or a right to health care, which, by the way, the Universal Declaration rather oddly calls a right to health. Would that?
Anybody else? There's one, no, back there first, and then Ray Langton. Is that okay?
Yeah, my name's Robert Schwartz. There's something that has
Can you hold the mic a little nearer to your mouth?
I'm sorry, do you hear me now?
Thank you.
Sorry. There's something that conceptually puzzles me, which is we talk about, you were just talking about the delivery of these rights, and we seem to talk about things like the state, who are the agents as the deliverer, but how does something which doesn't have a moral conscience, so to speak, which is a state itself, how do the ethics and the morals, using the fuller distinction, how do they who keeps the state on the right path, this agent, by utilizing ethical principles or moral principles? Who's the real agent here is really the question.
It's a very interesting question, and I take it you're not bothered about, although there are problems, assigning duties of justice to states, because they perhaps have the apparatus for that. But you are concerned about ethical duties being assigned to states, and indeed, who would not be? And I think it was just hinted at, rather than explicit, in the last few minutes of what I said, that we have to broaden our view of the agents and agencies involved. The state is not enough. And I would say there are two reasons why it's not enough. One is the phenomenon of globalization, that too much is something states cannot now manage. And you only have to think of the advent of the transnational corporation and the jurisdiction shifting for purposes of paying, or rather not paying, tax, to realize what I mean there. So states may be incompetent, but nobody can bring them to account. And more broadly, I would say that the phenomenon of globalization means we have to ask some serious questions about what are called, it's a clumsy phrase I know, the non-state actors. Now, the non-state actors are numerous, but actually they are doing more than people imagine. For example, many universally or very widely respected technical standards are reached by agreement between commercial organizations, working, yes, internationally, but not through states as agents. And there may be other things where it is more effective for a range of institutions and organizations to coordinate than it is for states to try to regulate, legislate, set up international agreements, the rest of it.
Now we're going to allow for the last question from Ray Langton.
Thank you so much, Onora. I want to make a connection with the topic about speech norms this morning. So I have found it immensely helpful thinking about what you say about duty in relation to rights. And I think there's a lazy dependence on the rhetoric of rights, which can't be so lazy when you insist on pointing the finger and say, well, who is going to deliver this, even in the case where there is a right. And I, as applied to free speech, I have found it really helpful in discussing with people who have sort of fundamentalist free speech instincts to say, okay, so let's see, whose duty is it? It's the duty of, for instance, this woman wearing the hijab on the train. It's her duty to put up with this tirade without any assistance from the state. It's her duty. So you're saying you're in favor of her having this duty. And in some ways, it's being unfair because I'm exploiting the thing you ascribed to Nietzsche, which then Ogden Nash took up in that little poem. Do people know this poem? Ogden Nash has got Ode to Duty. O duty, why hast thou not the visage of a sweetie or a cutie? And he wishes that duty was a bit nicer. To be able to locate the delivery of the duties in the people who actually are going to be in the hardest position to help deliver that duty, I found it really helpful. So this is partly a comment, but also partly an invitation on how you think that this might feed into the culture of the press.
Well, of course, I do think the issues we were discussing this morning about the dominant rights perspective on speech issues, where people think that freedom of expression is going to be the whole story, is an inadequate perspective. It's not just freedom of expression. And you give an example of the woman in the hijab being required to endure the tirade. I have to say I do have a difficulty with somebody who hides her face when speaking to me, because part of the duties of audience, I think, is to engage with the interlocutor. So I find your example unfortunate, because just as I would find a person in a balaclava intimidating, so I find other people, or who wears one of those hygiene masks across their face, even if they aren't in a cloud of noxious vapors. I think we do have to be able to follow one another's speech and one another's gestures. So, example apart, I think it's very important to realize that the audience is a lot of the picture here, the question not just of rights to express content, but also of duties to receive and respond to content are really important. Oh, I mean the veil is what I find offensive, yes, not the scarf. Most of the women in Europe wore scarves when I was a child. And you could see their faces and you could understand their words. Yeah. But so then, if the example is not meant to be of somebody who hides while speaking, like the internet examples we were discussing this morning, or someone who wears a balaclava, then I'm with you. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Onora.